mark in the baptistry. Whew. Okay. I am not awake today, as you guys may have noticed. I got very little sleep last night, most of this week. But now we'll go ahead and look at our teaching text. It comes from the book of Zechariah. We're in chapter 9, verse 9. Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey.
Oh, I muted myself. I went the opposite way. One of my favorite things to do with the kids, and I've had them kind of rocking solo this weekend with Ruth gone, is build Legos with the kids. And that is always a fun time to create something together, especially when it comes in a set. I really struggle to put something together with them when it's like free-flowing, like, because I always feel like I need more pieces, and then I'm like, I got to spend more money to get more pieces, to build more and better things. And I really like just being able to sit down with them to assemble just something, to create something that's enjoyable and fun. It definitely stretches my imagination, and it's fun to see what they come up with and do. They're in the process of building this giant Lego city, and it's kind of fun to see how they like create different scenes with it. And just working with Legos, if you've ever done that, like, or watched people do it, it's full of life lessons. The life lessons in working with Legos are everywhere. Simple sets teach kind of fundamentals and the basic blocks, and then following instruction teaches patience, and then you kind of go up and you graduate to more and bigger sets. And it's kind of funny because about halfway through the building, when I think, and I do this with my kids, they almost always are like, Dad, we're kind of done. Can you just like take over and like finish it? And so it's fun to like kind of help them take something that they've started and push it all the way through to the finish line. But I think the hardest lesson when I'm building with them is the moment when they've realized that they've built something wrong and have to undo your work to go back and get it right. And that's the same thing that's true for us as well, right? When we've put so much time and energy and work into something, creating something, building something, maybe it's a life, maybe it's a career, maybe it's even a set of habits for our own family, or even a set of habits for our own life. And then to realize in this next season or this new iteration that you might have to go back and unwind some of that work that you've done. And sometimes we don't even really do the hard work to go through that. Sometimes it's like, can I just scrap it and then buy a new program and kind of start over again? And so oftentimes when we think about crafting or building something like the good life, it's easier in our minds oftentimes, because we're in the West, is to think about, how do I just buy something to make it better? Can I just pay someone to do it, rather than doing the work ourselves to fix what might be broken? And so that's one of the toughest parts, is to undo something you've maybe even worked so hard at, and then learn to rebuild it correctly. Sometimes these skills, building, fixing, and increasing complexity, aren't absolutely just for Legos. You can start to apply that to every aspect of life. Your relationships, your finances, the very fabric of our reality, the workplace, and building the good life. And so it happens when sometimes the pieces don't fit or something doesn't quite line up. We realize we might have to go back, take some things apart to re-put it together. And sometimes the instructions don't always feel clear either, because that's what's nice about Legos, right? You get a step by step by step, but sometimes you come across that set in the book where the picture is kind of wonky and you can't quite tell what needs to go where. My frustration every time that happens is I'm like, come on, you spent all this money to put this book together. Can't we just get it right? Make it clear. And we do those kind of things in the areas of life that I had already mentioned. We just wish there was a step-by-step, done-for-you guide that says, do this, fix this, show up here, do this, and then maybe life would be better. It's hard when you've built something wrong and you don't quite know how to fix it. It's where the dream of what could be clashes with the mess of what is maybe in your life, and you realize you need to unwind it. And that's where we actually find God's people in the book of Zechariah. It's where often we find ourselves today. It's living between the hope of heaven, the hope of a final finished product, where everything is right and good and in its place, and earth, and figuring out how do we put this thing all together. So let me set the scene for Zechariah in our Between Heaven and Earth series. It's about 520 BC, and God's people have been in exile. They've been in Babylon. They've been away from stability and security of their home for about 70 years. And for many of these people, it's been an entire lifetime of trying to build something good and right and settle down. And now there's this longing to come back, and they've been freed to come back to the promised land. And the prophet Jeremiah had promised them that after these 70 years, God would bring them home. And now he has, to restore his temple, that he would send a messianic king and establish his kingdom. And so now they're back, and they're saying, okay, you filled a part of your promise. When is the rest going to show up? But life was a mess for them as they tried to rebuild. Failed crops, hostile neighbors, and the temple in ruins. And this is where God ushers in Zechariah and Haggai to rebuild the temple and hold on to hope. But the 70 years were nearly up. But God's final promise in some of these areas felt impossible. And they started to ask the question, is it even possible to build something good amidst the chaos? And Zechariah says yes, showing us how to fix and rebuild, and not just discard and start over. The image in my mind is taking that set of Legos and just being like, swiping it off and say, someone else do it. But Zechariah, as we work through this book, invites us to look above the chaos and hope for God's presence, for his kingdom. And it motivates us to faithfulness in this present moment. See, God's plan will come to pass, but we're called to prepare ourselves to receive it. The speeches and visions that Zechariah is going to have and share with the people of God give a picture of really what was, attitudes and lifestyles, and then what is, and then what is to come. And as we find ourselves in this time and in this place, it's helpful to remember the story of what was, what is, and what will be. And so these steps help us prepare to live in the reality of God's promises. And so 3 steps to really build it right, so to speak, are simply returning to God's heart, embracing his vision for renewal, and clinging to the hope of the coming king. So first step is what Zechariah wants the people to do when they find themselves in the midst of chaos. To stand between heaven's hope and the promises and earth's brokenness and chaos is to simply return to God's heart. Zechariah starts with a clear instruction. He says, "Return to me, says the Lord of hosts, and I will return to you." The exiles were in Jerusalem, but their hearts were a jumble of wrong pieces, distracted, discouraged. Their ancestors ignored the prophets like Jeremiah, building lives of idolatry and injustice that led them to exile. They were building the wrong thing the wrong way. And Zechariah says, don't be like them. Don't build like they did. Turn back to God. And the people repented, saying, the Lord has done what he purposed. But returning to God isn't a one-time snap. It's a daily choice to align with his design. See, sometimes when you start to build and craft something, something comes in and just wrecks all the pieces. And there in that moment, you can, again, choose to scrap it and say, no, I'm done with this. I'm going a different direction. But the heart of God is to re-engage with him and receive his love and begin to build again. Because he gives us a plan and a purpose. And you might be staring at a pile of broken pieces even in your life today. Stress at work, tension at home, a faith that feels shaky. And so return to God may feel like a simple but yet overwhelming notion to say, or some of you even here are like, well, yeah, Kyle, of course, like return to God. Like that seems overly simple. Like that's what you're supposed to say as a pastor standing in front of people, like giving us instruction. But return to God isn't just something that we say with our lips, but it's a heart posture. It starts to show itself up in our lives. It's where, when we say return to God, it's really extending ourselves in trust again in relationship. It's extending ourselves in trust again to be close and near to people. To even be willing to say, I'm going to open up my life so that people can see the true me. And the reason I say that as a first step of return to God is because God is a God of relationship. And as we draw near, he will stretch us and invite us to embody his character and priorities, which always means love our neighbor as ourselves, which means love him with every aspect, every total of our being, mind, soul, and body. It's a total body experience. And so return to God might feel like another step when you're already overwhelmed. But the reason that this is so important is because it's about fixing the foundation. So many times we try to clean up the things in our lives because we think that's what people want to see, or that's what people need, or that we're ashamed that there might be something lower down in our lives that we're afraid to address. But return to God is always about fixing the foundation and not simply starting over. I'll use a second building metaphor. I'll move beyond Legos to maybe something more structurally sound. But it's like trying to renovate a house while ignoring a cracked foundation. You can dress it up, you can make it real pretty, you can repaint it. But if you never deal with the foundation, the core, then no matter how nice it might be, it could come tumbling down. And the goal of the church, and really my responsibility as a pastor, is to help you and call you back to say, let's relook at the foundation. Let's look at the core again and again and again. Because we're fickle people. We're judgmental people. We evaluate lawns and what is going on in people's lives by their lawns or the exterior of the house. And we can joke about that like in a neighborhood sense, but we also do that in a relational sense. We do that as we get to know people. It's like we start to evaluate all the exterior. But first and foremost is as we move forward in a midst of chaos is return to God ourselves and deal with the core and the foundation of our faith. Who is God and what has he done for us? See, we can't live heaven's promises without aligning with God's character. And aligning with God's character always starts with us and coming back to that core. And so what Zechariah says is he says these people needed to repent. They needed to admit where they had been trying to dress up all the nice things and come back to that foundation of that they had not loved God with all that they are. They had started to build a life of things apart from God. And so we must align with his heart through holiness, justice, and mercy. And it's so hard because I just think about the last thing in your house that was broken. Like, what'd you do? When you saw that thing, the last thing in your house, some of you are like, oh, it broke, going in the trash, get it out of here. Some of you said, oh, it broke, I'm going to hold on to it because there's a chance I might fix it, or I know someone who could fix it, and it's still sitting broke somewhere in a bin or something around where it's like just in case we hold on to the broken things. Others of you, something broke, and you were resourceful, and you either fixed it yourself or you asked someone you were in a relationship to help actually fix it. So we can be a scrapper or a hoarder or a fixer, or maybe even just pretending it's fine. But the return to God piece is admitting that there's something below the surface that needs mended and needs healed. And asking God to do that in our hearts and in our minds first, so that then we can engage the wider world around us. Because this is what Zechariah is inviting the people into, is as they are building their lives, first build their hearts and their homes around the Lord. Because then as they do that, they can seek renewal in the public. See, God's priority isn't just about rebuilding structures, but restoring hearts. Restored hearts can build structures. And while the exiles' ancestors ignored the prophets, which led them into exile, Zechariah urges them to break the cycle by turning back to God's character, his holiness, his justice, and his mercy. And so we're going to be tempted to chase quick fixes, better systems, louder voices, and shinier programs. But God's call is for us to embody his heart first and then begin to embrace God's vision for renewal. See, God's vision for renewal is all-encompassing. It's relational. It's in the workplace. It's in our homes. It's in our health. And he actually gives us this blueprint in Zechariah. If you continue to read through the book, so I talked largely about chapter 1, but if you start to read through the rest of the book, you're going to get these series of bizarre visions and pictures of what's happening. You're going to get these bizarre dreams. You're going to get horsemen reporting that the world is at peace under Persian rule, but the people are confused. Because they're going to be like, hey, if these 70 years are up and there's peace, where's the promised kingdom? God's answer, it's coming, but in my timeline, not yours. You're going to see that God shows Zechariah the high priest Joshua and these filthy clothes. Again, these are dreams, these are visions representing Israel's sin. And God replaces them with clean garments. The message, God is ready to forgive and restore. See, as we seek God's heart, God reveals himself to us, that he's ready to forgive and restore, that everything is in his timing and control. But the people need to be ready to receive it. There's even this vision of this lampstand fed by olive trees that symbolizes God's presence with Joshua and Zerubbabel, so this high priest and this new king. And as they are called to rebuild, if you go back and read Ezra and Nehemiah, this is what it's talking about in these time periods. But they're called to rebuild by God's Spirit, not by their own effort. And altogether, these visions emphasize that the coming of this promised Savior, that this rescue, that the reordering of life in their lifetime was going to be conditional upon this generation becoming faithful to God. Now, that condition and promise is a prelude to the promises that are available to us, that they were specific to them. But it really leads us to the conclusion of a dream and visions that we find ourselves in Zechariah 7 and 8, where this blueprint, where these visions become even more practical, where they come and they've been mourning over the former temple's destruction for nearly 70 years. Some of us do that, right? We look back at our past and we go, maybe good things and bad things. And it feels like we've lost them. See, some of you right now, you look back and once good things that you held dear and you're still mourning for them. You're missing them. You're longing for them. For some of you, you look back at your past and you see a life of sin. And that still seems enticing. because things seemed better then, because it was more pleasurable, it was easier, the call to come and die to yourself, the call to build something good with God for others seems like what? And so here in this moment, when we look back at the past, and this is what they're doing, is they're looking back and they're wondering, is it worth it to rebuild the temple? Because what was lost, it's easier to mourn what was lost than step in faith with God and build something with him for the future. And so here they are. And they're actually asking Zechariah, should we stop grieving? And is God's kingdom coming soon? And so what does Zechariah do? Is he kind of takes them through this journey and reminds them and says, remember, your ancestors rejected God, led you to exile. And he repeats the challenge while weaving in a formative hope. And this picture that he gives them is one of Jerusalem restored, where there's people happy. And he says, old men and women will sit in the streets, children will play there. And what this picture is of total wellness called shalom, peace, justice, community, where heaven breaks in to earth. And it's this beautiful vision. It's something that they've longed for. He's saying it's going to come, but only if they pursue justice and peace and remain faithful to the covenant. So in other words, what Zechariah begins to do is he reverses their question. Should we stop grieving? And instead asks, will you become the kinds of people who are ready to receive and participate in God's coming kingdom? You know what's interesting in this book is, as you read through it, the people don't actually answer. And the book just kind of moves on. And this silence, this deafening silence, asks the question, will you become the kinds of people who are ready to receive and participate in God's coming kingdom? Starts to well up and demand an answer. And turns to the reader and really is directed at us today. Will you prepare for God's coming kingdom? Are you prepared? And it's not in some spiritual sense that says, oh, I'm ready, Lord Jesus, take me now. Get me out of here. It's the kind of heart preparation so that when you step into the midst of chaos, you're not afraid, but you're a stabilizing presence. It's the kind of thing when you see the situations and circumstances of our world, you're not overcome with anxiety. But there's a confidence and a hope that comes from because you know how the story ends. That you know as things and seasons change, your job may get taken away, some family member might die, your friend may move, your kid may not respond to you, and you may be having a really difficult time with them. But that doesn't shake you because that's not the finished part of the story. That your identity isn't in those things, but they're in who God says you are and his promises. And so the preparation for God's coming kingdom isn't can I manufacture or control the right circumstances? Can I do just the right thing? But it's as I'm doing something, my character and priorities are connected to the source of it all. Is my heart, am I first returning to God, and then am I looking up and looking out and seeing the craziness of our world? That is overwhelming, but is an opportunity to represent God, represent heaven, and the hope of eternity in the midst of earth's brokenness. That's the vision that he invites us to and calls us to not, some of us, I get it too. We can scroll, we can look, and what do? We complain. We criticize. And we're like, I wish someone would do something about that. And all the while, we're suppressing the Spirit of God within our hearts that says, yeah, I'm within you. Where you live, work, and play, that's where you do something. Sometimes it means speaking out. Sometimes it simply means showing up again and again and again. I know it's really easy right now. You hear it every single day, and I do too. Just cut out the toxicity. Cut out the negativity. Cut your bait and move. That's like sliding those Lego pieces right off the table and said, I'll go start over. I'll go do somewhere else. God's people are not called to cut our losses and run. God's people are called to build their lives in light of eternity wherever he has placed them. To step into that calling, not with fear or trepidation or anger, but with a hope of renewal. That people will see God's presence embodied in them because they are working on their foundation and building a good life with God for others. I'm glad Lego sets come with instructions. Because, again, I'm not great and I'm not super creative when it comes to kind of free-forming. And I realize that some of us, when I cast that kind of vision, when I say step into renewal, that can feel very overwhelming. It can feel like, well, what choice do I make? Where do I go? Where do I look? Like, give me that clear direction. I'm not all-knowing and I'm not omniscient, but I know someone who is. And so when you have the Spirit of God that can give you the creative capacity exactly where you are. And so we take our cues from two places. We take our cues from the Word and the Spirit, wherever he has placed us. See, the instruction manual that God has given us is the embodied presence of Jesus and the stories of the fulfilled promises when the people of God live out the realities and wills of God wherever they find themselves. And that's why Paul later in the New Testament just writes letters and say, live up to this calling, live up to this vision. I'm so glad that I got to see someone make something of their life, to read the stories so that as I seek to listen and learn from that, I can have the power and the creative capacity to try wherever God has placed me. And as I try, I'm not afraid of failure. Why? Because we can cling to the hope of the coming King. He has promised that he will make all things new. This is why Zechariah, when he's describing this in the Old Testament for the people, as they're waiting and anticipating this total renewal and restoration, in Zechariah 9, he comes and he says, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey. He shall speak peace to the nations." And this humble king brings God's kingdom. In Matthew 21, verse 5, the picture that we get is Jesus showing up to Jerusalem, riding a donkey, going all the way to his death, to death on a cross, and then being raised to new life. See, that is the hope that we have. You can try, you can risk. Why? Because death's not the end. That's not the end. When we are so, again, the return to God, when we are so settled in our foundation that God is who he says he is, and he'll do what he says he will do, and his promises are true, and that's our foundation because he's fulfilled those promises. The coming one, the one who would bring the eternal kingdom, showed up in Jesus. He keeps his promises. He does what he said he's going to do. When that's our foundation, if we can believe that he answers and keeps those promises, then we can also believe and be centered on the promises that death is not the end, that everything will be made new, that is our hope. And so we can try, we can risk, we can get creative. We don't have to worry or feel overwhelmed. but we can move forward with a stabilizing confidence. The long-awaited King will return. See, Jesus conquered differently than anyone had ever expected. Not with military force, but through the cross. Embodying radical humility, sacrifice, and a relentless love. So his resurrection doesn't just prove heaven's promises can break through Earth's chaos. It guarantees that they will. And here's what Zechariah's exiles missed, but we can't afford to. The condition of faithfulness that they struggled with was fully completed in Jesus. He became the faithful Israel that they couldn't be. He rebuilt what was broken, not by discarding the pieces, but by becoming the cornerstone himself, by giving us a foundation to stand on. And so while we're living between heaven and earth right now, between Jesus' first coming and his return, we don't have to be in exile wondering if God's kingdom will come. We know it's already broken through in Jesus, and we get to participate in building it. He says he will build it, but are we prepared to join him in that as we wait for its full arrival? The question Zechariah leaves hanging in the air that we have to ask ourselves again and again and again: will we become the kinds of people who are ready to receive and participate in God's coming kingdom? So often we want to say, well, yes, of course. The answer of yes and of course in our lives is how we start to show up for each other, to love our neighbors as ourselves, to look internal and say, God, how am I not loving you with my mind? How am I not loving you with my soul? How am I not loving you with my body? And begin to ask the reflective questions and seek to then make choices and live and allow the Lord to correct and convict and to shape us and continue to try again and again and again. It's a question that echoes for us today. Will we become the kinds of people who are ready to receive and participate in what God's doing? We talk here at Generations that we're committed to expanding God's family. And we take that commitment very seriously. The goodness of God's family and all that he has in terms of identity and love and provision and stability when the world is in chaos is available to people in our lives. To our neighbors, to our friends, to our coworkers. But so oftentimes we stand as barriers to the entrance into the family because we're not ready to let them into that story. And the call for us is to let them into that story. To say, yes, I want you a part of my eternal family. And I'm willing to include you. I'm willing to show you grace. I'm willing to practice out the difficult things of following Jesus, embodying his character and priorities in all areas. And do that not as a burden of performance, but as an invitation to partner with what God is already doing. Here's the great assumption that I want us to get comfortable making: that God is at work in the world, that he is at work in our lives, that he is at work where you go to work. He's at work in your neighborhood. And imagine if you stepped into every single day with that kind of assumption. God, you're here. How do I join you in what you're doing? What kind of world, what kind of life might that breed? I'll tell you, for someone who likes a little risk and likes a little excitement, but likes a little clarity in those step-by-step instructions, it makes for a really fun day. You never know what might happen. And you know what that increasingly does is that it kind of takes this perfectionist mentality of that we have to have it right at all times and kind of strips that away. And we can have honest conversations about, man, I got that wrong, or man, I took a risk, and look how God had showed up, and we tell that story. Man, that's so encouraging to each other, and we need to be comfortable sharing that and saying that with each other. And so when the life feels like it's in chaos, rather than start from scratch with random pieces scattered everywhere, we can go back and we can look to Jesus. His life, his death, and his resurrection. He's shown us exactly what God's character and priorities looks like. The proud brought low, the humble lifted up, the broken made whole, the outcast welcomed home. And sometimes these leave us a little confused, but thanks be to God that he promises the Holy Spirit, God's presence dwelling within us, empowering us to build faithfully even when we get it wrong and need to undo and rebuild. And so 3 movements to just recap. You got to return to God's heart daily. Simply, Lord, align my heart with yours. Help me see you, love what you love, and pursue what matters to you. Help me assume that you are at work. And that simple prayer resets your foundation. The second, embrace God's vision for renewal where you are. Zechariah painted a picture of total wellness, old and young together, children playing safely, justice flowing like a river. There's a reason why I'll never apologize for kids running around when we gather together as the church. I know sometimes they're throwing a paper airplane and they might hit you, so I will apologize for that. I don't want anyone to lose an eye. But that's the vision. Total wellness and peace and relaxation, because there's a people who loves them, wants them to know the Lord. And I hope that we have such peace, such relationships, such certainty that represents God well to the watching world who may want to shove kids in a corner or say, figure it out, or you don't belong here. But rather display the character of our great and loving King, that they're loved and they can be safe in his arms. And so we want to see that vision realized. And so third, cling to the hope of the coming King, living like that reality is already true. Living like he's already won. Because he has. He has. You don't have to fix everything. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to build the kingdom of your own strength. Remember, it's not by might nor by power, but by his Spirit, says the Lord. So I want you to think, I got this, when Zechariah is describing this, about this vision of shalom, this city, this community, this beautiful reality. I think of some of those dystopian movies where it's like you walk in and it's an abandoned town and windows are smashed out and everything is gray and bleak. And there's nothing, it's all concrete. Nothing's going to grow there. It's like, where is it? And it's like kind of that atomic bomb has hit and it's like there's just nothing left. God's people are called to step into that kind of reality and not fix it all back up at once, but simply plant a seed so that something might grow and the world might change. And so when you return to God's heart, when you see a vision for renewal and you live as if he's already won, then you can have the freedom to plant little seeds. Assume that God is already at work and going to grow that seed into something beautiful. That's the garden that we want to cultivate as we await heaven's hope amidst earth's brokenness. May we build, may we plant seeds, may we work to build a good world with God for others. And I'll give you probably one more piece here. That's why we do the Thanksgiving baskets. That's why we set out a meal train for Charles. It's why we do those little things. It's not because that's what good people do, but it's because people trying to see something different, to repattern, to set something different, to build a good world with God for others. We do these kinds of things because we can show the watching world there's a better and more beautiful story that they can be a part of. And so my hope and my prayer is that we assume that God is at work and we partner with him wherever we live, work, and play. And so to do that, will you become the kind of person who is ready to receive and participate in God's coming kingdom and God's growing